You got to take that hurdle first to kind of move the conversation from cost and time to all the other benefits that deconstruction has to offer.
It's difficult to capture all that the multi-hyphenate Felix Heisel has achieved and created in the world of circular architecture in the past 15 years. Since graduating from architecture school in Germany, circular construction has been a central focus of his career. He's authored numerous books and papers on the topic, created and now directs the Circular Construction Lab at Cornell University, and has led countless circular construction exhibitions and research projects around the world, including one of his most current, called AR3 Lumber, an AI-driven application that will visually grade reclaimed lumber. And at this year's Build Reuse conference, Felix shared some of the findings from their recent studies and what he sees as important next steps to bring circular architecture more mainstream. How did the Cornell Circular Construction Lab come to be?
The Circular Construction Lab is a cross-disciplinary research unit at Cornell University, and it started, I think, five and a half years now ago when I was appointed as faculty at Cornell, and I kind of started this as a research hub for all the activities that we're doing. And one of the key aspects of the lab is really the collaboration with a broad set of industry and academic partners, because the questions that we're asking are so large that there's no way that architecture as a discipline, but also a lab in itself, could answer these questions. And so we're reaching out across disciplinary boundaries to answer these large systemic questions on how we can move a currently still very linear industry towards circular paradigms.
What were some of your first kind of initiatives or research projects?
The questions that we're asking are sort of twofold. On the one hand side, there's the question, what can we do with all the materials that are bound currently in buildings in the built environment? And how can we activate those as a resource for future construction? Meaning, what kind of technologies, techniques, methods do we need to take them out of buildings, to repurpose them, to reuse them ideally? And then on the other side, the other question is, so now that we have all these materials, what do we do with them? How can we build differently from now on so that the buildings of the future don't have the same problems that we've just encouraged or encountered in the existing buildings? And so when we set out to understand this, one of the first projects were actually to do a deconstruction project, to kind of get hands dirty and see and understand the barriers and limits of reactivation of materials. And so we did what we call the Catherine Commons Deconstruction Project, which is a deconstruction of a 13-bedroom, 4,500 square foot residential building in downtown Ithaca. And the real benefit of that was that we had sort of a side-by-side comparison between a demolition project and a deconstruction project that were coming down at the same time, that were built in the same time period, that were sort of comparable in size. And so the study that evolved out of that gave us real, sort of reliable data whether deconstruction in the specific context of Ithaca is time competitive or is cost competitive to the current standard demolition processes. And many of the projects that we're now working on sort of started with this initial study of a deconstruction project.
And how did you have to engage specialists that already knew how to deconstruct buildings, or how did you guys approach that?
Yeah, naturally. We at that point, we knew very little about deconstruction, and so within a grant that we were able to get from the David M. Einhorn Center at Cornell, it's a Center for Community Engagement. The goal was really to go out and find community partners to partner on this project, and so we engaged the local labor union to do the work. We engaged a local design and carpentry company to run the show, essentially. We brought in Finger Lakes Reuse as the local reuse center to manage the material flows and actually sell the product afterwards. And we brought in Dave Benning, who is sort of an acclaimed deconstruction expert in the nation, to advise on the process. And so that as a team was an extremely successful group to take down this building, but also to maximize the material reuse at the end and to bring these materials that we salvaged back into the market.
What were some of the major lessons learned from that?
There were a couple. When you start with a deconstruction project, and in this case it was the same, the developer that owned these buildings, there were actually 11 buildings, and so 10 were being demolished and one was being deconstructed. The developer had essentially two conditions. And they were, it can not cost him any more than the demolition, and it cannot take more time than the demolition. And these are the two main concerns that all the deconstruction projects run against, right? Everyone says, well, it takes more time. Time is money, costs more, there's more labor involved. And so what we were able to show in this project was that in the end, we were actually time and cost competitive with the demolition project that was happening right next door. Because we shifted to a process that's called panelized deconstruction. And so that essentially cuts down the building into the largest possible components and then moves them offsite for post-processing. And so the process on-site is actually really quick. It's kind of compared to modular construction. It's kind of modular deconstruction. We're bringing these panels offsite. And so it took us 4.5 days to take the whole house down. The demo crew was done in 2.5 days, but when we're talking 2 or 4 days, that's fine from a contractor perspective, right? If you talk 2 days versus 3 weeks, 4 weeks, then it becomes sometimes difficult in the scheduling of a construction site. And then the other side, on the financial side, we were able to show that we can offset the extra labor costs that is involved in the project through the resale of the materials that we salvaged. And that's actually the really good news, because then you can start talking about the things you really want to talk about the fact that we created jobs, that there's a local market for these materials, that we reduce the emissions, that there's no material going to landfill, et cetera, right? But you got to take that hurdle first to kind of move the conversation from cost and time to all the other benefits that deconstruction has to offer.
That idea of the panelized deconstruction is so fascinating too, and then how those modules are in some cases able to just be reused into a future construction.
Yeah, that's sort of that's the ultimate goal. If we could actually cut panels out of buildings and use them as they are, because you save the time in having to post-process and take things apart to then put them back together. That requires a lot of effort on the design of the deconstruction, right? Because you need to cut the panels. You need to know already where these panels go when you start deconstruction, because you need to cut them to specs, right? To the specifications of the new design. This unfortunately still happens very rarely, because this alignment of the donor building and the host building and the design timelines of these projects is rarely yet this well aligned. The benefit is that you cut out the storage, right? And storage is one of the key cost components in reuse. Like every time you touch a material, it gets more expensive. Right? Every time you have labor involved and move it from one place to the other, price increases. And so if you're able to move a product from the deconstruction side to the construction side without an intermediate, then you're again moving towards a much more cost competitive or maybe even cost beneficial product compared to virgin resources.
I like how you put that too. It's like time and touch add cost to that. That's really interesting. yesterday you were talking about autonomous deconstruction, or that was brought up quite a bit.
Yeah.
What is that?
That's sort of a possible future. The idea could be that, or the question is how much robots, machines, technology do we want to introduce into this process, and where are the benefits of these technologies? And I think the verdict is still out, right? Because on many in many aspects, the fact that deconstruction, for example, creates labor is a positive, right? And so now to say, oh, we can also do that with the robot, is maybe counterproductive to some of the good benefits of deconstruction. On the other side, there are technologies, and that's sort of what we wanted to discover in this session yesterday, where technology can really help advance and scale deconstruction into a much larger market segment. And so the autonomous parts of this could be the material detection, it could be material assessment, material grading. It can definitely be a help on the construction side in cases where things become dangerous, for example, right? The sending in technological solutions, robots, equipment, in case of people, right, can be an advantage. So I think that there in all of these steps of a very long value chain from deconstruction to reuse, there are moments where technology can help us, and those are of very high interest to the circular construction.
So speaking of the visual grading of salvaged lumber, you did talk yesterday about using AI possibly for that. How is that currently being implemented, or is it still in the test phases?
So we are developing a technology that would sort of combine artificial intelligence with a very clear rule-based system of visual grading. And that feels to me as a really good use of artificial intelligence, because it remains in this sort of clearly set rule system that comes from grading standards and in the rule sets of the inspection bureaus across the nation. But then it applies these rules to image data, essentially, that you can just take a picture of the piece of lumber, right? And the technology will tell you, well, this is a stud grade 2, or it's 1, or it's structural, or it's better than that. And it allows for the evaluation of a salvage piece, whether it could, for example, go into a structural application. And that's one of the key problems that we're having in salvage lumber reuse at the moment, is that in many states, in 48 states, you're not allowed to use lumber structurally, salvage lumber structurally. We have 2, Washington and Oregon, where the code allows the reuse of lumber for residential constructions. But in all the others, that's not possible right now. And so the current use of salvaged lumber is usually as a kind of backdrop of a bar to kind of give it a salvaged aesthetic, right? And that's not, while this is a perfectly applicable use of the material, right? It doesn't fully activate the capacity of what the material could do, right? It used to be a structural material. We took it down from a building where it was the structure of that building, and so why not use it again? In many cases, salvaged lumber is better than what we're getting right now on the market, because it's dry, it's been in a building, it's been protected for many years. When at the time it was cut, the environment was different, the climate was different, the growth rings usually are tighter. Trees were older when they were cut 100 years ago than they are today, and so the quality of that material is incredible. And so the question is, why don't we use it structurally, right? And so some of these tools help to overcome these barriers, and our hope is that by using sort of a really low-tech approach to it, meaning that anyone who has a phone can take a picture, run the app, and get a result. You would take out sort of high equipment cost, for example. You can, already today you can do machine grading, you can send it through an X-ray, you can do acoustic grading, but all of these processes are attached to laboratories, locations, high equipment cost. And so our hope is to kind of democratize this technology by sending it to everyone on their phones.
That's amazing. Is that the primary focus of research right now in the circular?
It's one of the key focus points. We recently did a lot of work on lumber because it's the material that we get most in upstate New York. When you deconstruct a building, you get lumber. It's also one of the low-hanging fruits to some extent because it should be a material that is easy to reuse, right? If you take away some of the hurdles. Another focus of the research recently was a lot of policy work, and that is, the reasoning is the same, right? To kind of break down barriers and generate a framework that reuse can really thrive in. And so we've been working together with especially a senator and an assembly member in the New York State Assembly and Senate to develop a kind of a suite of bills to allow for reuse, kind of incentivize deconstruction ordinances, talk about the certification of deconstruction contractors, support infrastructure that is necessary for reuse. And so while these bills haven't been passed yet, some of them went through one of them, for example, unanimously was passed in the Senate but didn't get through the Assembly yet. So we're working on this, right? Or supporting our representatives in this process. But what is so exciting about it is that this conversation is happening, right? Because that wouldn't have happened 3 years, 5 years ago, right? And now there's a momentum. And so having these conversations, I think, will really help when these bills are being reintroduced in January in the next legislative period to hopefully move them through rather quickly.
So is the goal then to shift the code nationwide, or does that have to occur on the state level?
The US, generally, the system, especially when it comes to construction, is very local, right? So every town has the right to have their own building code, right? And so I think that's an interesting question to understand, like, where do we introduce what? In many cases, the local building codes are based on the International Construction Code, for example, but it can take a long time for these to trickle down. So if we're making a change to the ICC in 2026, it might take 3 years, 6 years until local jurisdictions then follow that code. And so while I think that's really important to do, other steps like developing municipal deconstruction ordinances or developing state-level suggestions and incentives and sort of financial programs to support local municipalities is equally important. Right? So that we want to work on all of these scales simultaneously to move the needle as quickly as we can.
I did want to ask you about material passports, because I know you've talked a lot about that. Are there currently any that are in existence already?
There are material passport requirements in Europe. The US has not implemented any requirements like that yet. But if you're in certain countries, not all 27, but in certain countries in the European Union, if you're applying for a building permit, you're now required to submit a material passport as part of the permitting documentation. And the goal there is that this is a kind of data set that is stored similarly to we used to store, or we still do, the plan set, right? And so now when a building comes to the end of their use, you could go in and say, okay, now let's look at the catalog of materials. A material passport essentially stores material quantities, qualities, connection details. And so in case of a deconstruction, you would know exactly which materials are where before you even go in. Currently, what we'd have to do in a case like that is an audit, a pre-deconstruction audit, costs time, labor. You would probably still have to do that because the key question with material passporting is actually not who generates the material passport, but who keeps it updated over the lifetime of a building. So every time you renovate something, every time you change a carpet, you should essentially update that index, right? That catalog of materials. And we don't have enough experience yet to see whether this is something that's feasible or that's actually being done. But I think these documents are going to be tremendously helpful in at least understanding what is 90% of the building, right? The embodied carbon is usually in the structure, and the structure is the one thing that really doesn't change much. So yes, we can change the color of the interior. That actually doesn't matter that much. It's important to like what is the steel grade and when was it put there, and you know how is it assembled, how do we take it apart, and that's all stored in the material passport. And so we're really supporting the implementation of material passports as a documentation for the end of use of current buildings.
That would be ideal to have like a digital twin essentially of it, and if people kept it up. But so is that what you're working on in Ithaca? Because you spoke yesterday about using LiDAR technology to kind of create these.
To some extent that's what we're doing. I think there's a difference between sort of a really detailed material passport, which we can do for a new construction most easily, right? And the question, how do we now understand all the existing buildings that do not have a material passport because they were built 100 years ago when this wasn't a requirement, right? And so our hope in that Ithaca project is to find ways to estimate material quantities in all of the existing buildings, because those are naturally a little bit lower resolution than the material passport I just described earlier. But it's a way to kind of start a conversation about which housing typology or which building typology, for example, is most prone to certain strategies. And if we start decarbonizing the built environment, where should we start? What are low-hanging fruits? Where can we employ which strategy? What do we expect to get out of these? And then we can plan already now what would be reuse strategies for specific material quantities. So the goal really is to essentially understand this urban mine as a resource, and then start planning for the future.
What's one of the mindset shifts that needs to take place to make circularity and reuse more of the norm?
I think the most important mindset shift is probably that we stop thinking about a building as an investment that we build to hand over to someone else on day one of its existence, right? So the many problems are ingrained in the investment strategies that are currently dominating our built environment. Because if you're not the one living in the building, taking care of the building, having to deal with the end of use of the building, then design for disassembly strategies, for example, are much harder to justify if they were to cost, 3% more, right? But if you're the one that is, in the end, paying for the tipping fees of the materials when you have to clear the site at the end of the use time of the building, those 3% initial extra investment are probably cheaper than the cost of the clearing of the site at the end, right? And so if we're looking at And I think that's sort of a sustainability strategy anyways. We should always look at whole life building. It doesn't matter if it's an LCA or if it's cost or if it's circularity, right? But in all of these cases, so if we look at whole life strategies, then sustainability strategies tend to actually be cheaper. But of course, for that to work, you need to look at the whole life. At the end, at the beginning, there's always a slightly higher, probably, I mean, at least until we reach an economy of scale, but at the moment where all of these are kind of one-off strategies that we're developing, the initial upfront cost might be slightly higher, right? And so that I think is a really fundamental shift in how we design and build and read and manage our built environment.